Now, South Africa has joined the rest of the world in commemorating International Anti-Corruption Day today. Now, the day raises awareness about the consequences of corruption, and it also supports efforts to fight it. Joining us now to talk about the extent of private sector corruption is Gugu Mclaren-Ushewokunze, the National Business Initiative Head of Social Transformation. Good to have you with us this afternoon, ma'am. Now, I'm quite interested to find out, it is International Anti-Corruption Day. Corruption is very much of a buzzword in South Africa. It has been for quite a while now. How do the corruption levels in South Africa fare in comparison to the rest of the world and perhaps even the continent?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me on this day and talking about what I think is a really important and critical issue in South Africa. So unfortunately, this isn't an area that South Africa does very well in, and I think that is not a surprise for any of us, considering most recent issues around corruption, but also quite a long history of corruption existing both in the public sector and the private sector. So comparatively, South Africa does not do very well when it comes to ethical behavior and anti-corruption.
And are we looking here specifically at the public sector, the private sector, or both?
It's an interesting question. If I think about when I engaged with our private sector members a few years ago, there was a very strong belief that corruption really took place in the public sector alone. But I think over the past few years, what we've seen and the kind of issues that have arisen in a lot of companies, I think it's clear that this is something that is a countrywide issue, and something that we have to take quite seriously in the private sector as well.
Now, you have done, as you've said, a lot of research in this area. Take us perhaps through some of the key findings as far as corporate corruption is concerned and the reasons behind that.
So we most recently launched a report that looked at transparency in reporting. We did this in collaboration with our partners, Corruption Watch and ODI. And what this research study did was to look at the levels of transparency of corporate reporting with a particular focus on corruption. And what we wanted to understand from this study was how much companies are sharing, doing with regards to anti-corruption, and if we can measure across sectors the level of transparency in reporting on anti-corruption. What we found is that there are some very strong sectors, the mining sector, retail sector, and finance. And then there's some sectors that aren't doing as well. We also found that companies that are listed have significantly higher levels of transparency, and those that are privately owned do not. And I think that kind of makes sense looking at the kind of regulatory aspects of it. But the interesting finding from this study is that a lot of companies will talk about the policies and the systems they have in place, but they don't go into detail around what actually takes place within their companies and the detail around it. Are policies adhered to? Are issues being raised? How are they dealt with? How many issues have happened? I think there is a level that we need to go to in order to really understand what's happening within companies when it comes to corruption.
And perhaps that's a good place to go in, because I wanted from you a definition of exactly what corruption is. What constitutes corruption? And do we all have a common understanding of that?
I don't think we all have a common understanding of that, certainly. I think that within the private sector, I mean, there's a whole host of guidance that talks around what corruption is. Everything from your procurement processes and what happens there, if there are issues around bribery, if there are issues around withholding information. There's quite an extensive list of issues. Fraud would fall under that as well. But I think it does speak to the level of transparency, the level of accountability that takes place within companies, and that things are done procedurally and by the book. And I think that there isn't a shared understanding, and I would go so far as to say, even within South African society, if we think about the as individuals, do we think that giving money to a police officer at a roadblock is considered corruption? Some people would say that it's actually warranted. So I do think that this is where there are some blurry elements. I think there's some elements that are very clear, but there's some that are a little blurry, and that's where the whole conversation around ethics and ethical behavior that comes in and is can be quite a gray area.
And when we talk about grey areas, what then is the measure whose perspective ultimately prevails as to what constitutes corruption and what doesn't?
It's a great question, and I think that the usual guidance is there are regulatory and legislative guidance around these issues. And what you find is where there can be confusion is where, say, a company operates in a country that has different legislative guidelines, and the decision of, well, what do we do? Because in order to do business, I have to pay this bribe. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. But this is the way it's done within this jurisdiction. And I think the guidance is taking the most detailed, the most robust guidance and using that as the framework. And that requires companies to make some very hard decisions. It requires companies to say, well, then we can't do business in that area because it goes against what we believe is right. And I think that is very much where we need a stronger sense of business leadership around taking a stance around what we will do and what we will not do, and staying true to that.
And how does one topple, turn around, reinvent a habituation within corporates? Because there is a corporate culture that would inevitably exist.
Another great question, and it's one of the things that our CEO, Joanne Yawich, talked about in today's commemoration of Anti-Corruption Day. And it talks about the need for strong ethical leadership within the private sector that sets the tone for how we do business. And what that leadership needs to do is firstly take quite a strong stance and position on where we stand with corruption, and let that translate into organizational cultures. I think that's a critical element. One of the things we looked at in our research that the NBI did earlier this year was looking at the link between company values and corrupt behaviors. If you have a value that talks about financial gain, it's sending a message that that is what the company believes is important. And very often employees take that as a message that they can do whatever is required in order to get that financial gain.
Okay, can I just ask you something here, because this is another gray area. Because when you are in business to make money. So then, monetary gain would then perhaps be a value that a company that is serious about doing business would maybe have.
Totally agree. I think that it's understood that that is what business is about. But I think what's important is the way that it's done and setting the right parameters for how we achieve that. And if we're saying that financial gain any means necessary, then you're opening it up to all kinds of ways of doing business that doesn't align with the values that you want. And actually, if you look at some of the studies done globally, there's quite a significant financial implication on businesses because of corruption. And so while you might have an immediate short-term gain, in the long run, no one benefits from a society and an economy that is existing within a corrupt system.
When we look at our law enforcement, and even when we look at public scrutiny, do you believe that corporate offenders in the space of corruption are meted out with the same type of retribution as those who may be in the public sector?
I think that what we've seen over the last few years is certainly the emergence of a lot of corruption issues within the private sector, and companies that have had to really take recourse of these things. And some of these companies have been very public in terms of sharing the work that they've had to do in addressing these issues. I do think that it is not it's not equal. I think that there is still a stronger focus on the public sector, but I think what's happened in the last few years has certainly made private sector companies a lot more nervous and a lot more committed to addressing corruption within their organizations.
And I wonder, Gugu, is this an international trend that the focus is more on the public sector as opposed to the private sector, or is this something that's unique to South Africa or even the African continent?
So I would say that it is something that certainly South Africa and other African countries do have a spotlight on. I think there is the perception that African countries have higher degrees of corruption. But again, as we've seen, particularly in this COVID period and the number of cases of corruption that have come up globally, it's actually a global issue. And I think that there are lessons that we can learn from South Africa because it is so public, and it is something that we've been fairly transparent about in the public sector. I think there is room to do more of that in the private sector.
Before I let you go, Gugu, I'm quite interested in this program that you have as the National Business Initiative. It's titled Ethical Leadership and Anti-Corruption. What exactly goes into a program of that nature?
So for us, we see ethical leadership and anti-corruption as fundamental to the NBI's strategy around economic and social transformation. We know that that corruption has huge implications for the kind of development work and the kind of transformation that we need to see to address issues of inequality and inequity. So it's quite a critical issue for us. What we're developing at the moment is a capacity building platform for the private sector to really deal with the behavioral elements of anti-corruption. So a lot of companies will have systems and processes in place, but don't deal with, when it comes down to it, how do I know the decision that I need to make? What is the right way to make a decision? And that is the support that we want to provide to our member companies. What we also do is a lot of dialogue and engagement with private sector leaders around issues of ethics and anti-corruption as a way of making sure that this is something that is discussed within the private sector and that there is a very open dialogue and sharing among companies.
And what have you found to be the tradition as far as the fate of whistleblowers in the private sector is concerned? I mean, we're seeing what's happening in government, but what is the lay of the land in the private sector?
Unfortunately, it is not that much better. I think that this is an area that a lot of work needs to go into around how do you ensure that whistleblowers have the right protections when they are sharing what is going on within companies. So I think this is an area that the private sector and public sector have a lot of work to do. And one of the focus areas of this program that we are developing is to look at what needs to be put in place to ensure that if you have a whistleblowing policy, that you are incentivizing people to actually use it, because most people fear for their jobs, fear for victimization, and a whole host of other things that deter anyone with information from coming forward.
Gugu, it's been great talking to you today. A lot of insight as we mark International Anti-Corruption Day. Thank you so much for your time. That is Gugu Mclaren-Ushewokunze, NBI Head of Social Transformation, as we focus on International Anti-Corruption Day.